Chapter 10. Peanut Farmer. Jimmy Carter cultivated the image of a jolly populist who grew up on a farm, ran a peanut warehouse, and championed the working man. The presidency is a place of compassion, Carter said in accepting his nomination for a second term at the 1980 Democratic National Convention. My own heart is burdened for the troubled Americans, the poor and the jobless and the afflicted. Behind the scenes, it was a different story. Carter was just very short and rude most of the time, an agent recalls. With agents, he'd just pretend like you were not around. You'd say hello, and he'd just look at you like you weren't there, like you were bothering him. Carter actually told Secret Service agents and uniformed officers he did not want them to greet him on his way to the Oval Office. It was apparently too much bother for him to have to say hello back to another human being. Nor did Carter have much use for the military. Even though he was a Naval Academy graduate, Carter talked down to the military, just talked like they didn't know what they were talking about, a former agent says. Carter didn't want military aides to wear uniforms, former agent Cliff Baranowski recalls. Not surprisingly, of all the presidents in recent memory, Carter was the chief executive most detested by Secret Service agents. Agent John Piasecki was on Carter's detail for 3.5 years. That included 7 months of driving him in the presidential limousine. Aside from giving directions, Carter never spoke to him, he says. Carter tried to project an image of himself as a man of the people by carrying his own luggage when traveling, but that was another charade. When he was a candidate in 1976, Carter would carry his own bags when the press was around, but would ask the Secret Service to carry them the rest of the time. As president, Carter, codenamed Deacon, orchestrated more ruses involving his luggage. When he was traveling, he would get on a helicopter and fly to Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base, says former Secret Service agent Baranowski. He would roll up his sleeves and carry his bag over his shoulder, but it was empty. He wanted people to think he was carrying his own bag. Carter made a big show about taking a hang-up carry-on out of the trunk of the limo when he'd go someplace. And there was nothing in it, says another agent who was on his detail. It was empty. It was just all show. Carter would regularly make a show of arriving early at the Oval Office to call attention to how hard he was working for the American people. He would walk into the Oval Office at 6 a.m., do a little work for half an hour, then close the curtains and take a nap, says Robert B. Solomon, Jr., who was on Carter's detail. His staff would tell the press he was working. Another agent says that at other times he could see Carter through the Oval Office windows, dozing off in his desk chair while he was ostensibly working. Carter was a phony, an absolute phony, an agent says. When he was in a bad mood, you didn't want to bring him anything, a former Secret Service agent says. It was this hunkered-down attitude. I'm running the show. It was as if he didn't trust anyone around him. He had that big smile, but when he was in the White House, it was a different story. The only time I saw a smile on Carter's face was when the cameras were going, says former agent George Schmalhofer, who was assigned periodically to the Carter detail. Perhaps because of his aversion to the military, Carter refused to let the military aide with the nuclear football stay in a nearby trailer when Carter was visiting his home in Plains, Georgia. Carter did not want the nuclear football at Plains, a former agent says. There was no place to stay in Plains. The military wanted a trailer there. He didn't want that. So the military aide had to stay in Americus. The town was a 15-minute drive from Carter's home. Carter didn't want anyone bothering him on his property, the former agent explains. He wanted his privacy. Terrence Adamson, Carter's lawyer, denied that Carter refused to let the military aide stay near his residence. But Bill Gully, who was in charge of the operation as director of the White House Military Office, confirmed it. Carter may have shown no interest in protecting the country from a nuclear attack, but he loved to pore over the inner workings of the White House, including how the air conditioning worked. He even delved into how the Secret Service transported presidential limousines. Carter decided that to save money, they should be driven across the country instead of flown. Because the Air Force flew the vehicles as part of training, the Secret Service believed that Carter's plan actually increased costs. A sign of another Carter project. An agent recalls seeing the blueprints for a new submarine on Carter's desk in the private study off the Oval Office. I don't know what the hell he was trying to do, figuring out if it would work, the agent says. While he publicly denied it, Carter would personally schedule the times when aides could play on the White House tennis courts. Carter said, "I'm in charge," a former Secret Service agent says. "Everything is my way." He tried to micromanage everything. You had to go to him about playing on the tennis court. It was ridiculous. Agents were convinced that Carter as president was in over his head and that Rosalind was the smarter one. She had a loving relationship with her husband and acted as an advisor, sometimes firmly correcting what he said. Unlike her husband, she treated agents with respect. Rosalind really was the brains of the outfit, says former agent Rapaski. She kept him in line and constantly advised him. She was very pragmatic and organized. He would make an ultra-liberal comment and she would ground him and tell him he had to be more centrist. If he didn't listen, she could get cold and steely. "I think the presidency was too big for Carter to comprehend," says former agent Raymond Dunlap. In recent memory, according to agents, the brattiest offspring of a president was Amy Carter, who was 10 when her father became president. Amy was spoiled rotten, an agent on her detail says. "Amy Carter was a mess," says Brad Wells, an Air Force One steward. "She would look at me and pick up a package of open soda crackers and crush them and throw them on the floor. She did it purposely. We had to clean it up. That was our job." Secret Service agents guarding Amy, codenamed Dynamo, at school often found themselves in the middle when Amy wanted to play with friends after school instead of going home to the White House to do her homework, as she was supposed to do. When agents told her she had to go home, Amy would call her father and hand the phone to the agents, Dennis Chomiki, who was on her detail, remembers. The president would say to take Amy anywhere she wants to go. Amy just had her father wrapped up. Since Amy would often stay at a friend's house through the evening, agents wound up working longer hours than if they had taken her directly to the White House. As a result, says Chomiki, the detail would always try to get Mrs. Carter, the First Lady, on the phone because she would say, "Nothing doing. She's coming home. She's got her homework to do." Of all the presidential children guarded by the Secret Service, Carter's second oldest son, James Earl Chip Carter III, was one of the least liked. 26 when his father won the presidency, Chip had helped campaign for him in 1976 and again gave speeches on his behalf when Carter ran for re-election in 1980. He was outrageous, a Secret Service agent says. Chip was out of control. Marijuana, liquor, chasing women. Separated from his wife, Chip would pick up women in Georgetown and ask if they wanted to have sex in the White House. Most of them did. He did it as often as he could, the agent says. At one point, Rosalind Carter told the press that all 3 of her sons had experimented with marijuana. Their oldest son, John William Jack Carter, was discharged by the Navy for smoking weed. After he left the presidency, Jimmy Carter often went skiing and fishing with Rosalind in Colorado. He'd go skiing and he'd take lessons, and his wife would take lessons too, a former agent says. But he wouldn't listen to his instructor. He thought he was an expert. He'd go skiing and she'd go skiing, and he'd keep falling down or not doing things right, and she would do everything right the way the instructors taught her. He'd get pissed off because she was a better skier than he was. The same pattern played out when the couple went fishing. She'd go out there in the middle of the stream and go fishing, and he'd be out there thinking he was the best fisherman in the world, the former agent says. He'd be tossing that line out there and she'd be catching fish, and he'd get just furious because he couldn't catch a fish and she could.